This is macro review lecture number 3. We're going to start off talking about the business cycle in a little more detail than what we mentioned in the last lecture. The business cycle, as mentioned in the last lecture, is responsible for cyclical unemployment. And it has four basic parts to the business cycle that need to be understood and memorized for the AP exam. The top, as we deviate, this is a long-term trend, growth path of the economy. Around this growth path, we have deviations. These are the deviations around this growth path based on the misestimation or misunderstanding of what the demand will be for products as we build up inventory, need to deplete the inventories, and then finally build the inventories again. The peak here, the highest deviation away from the long-term growth path, we call the peak. As the economy is expanding, hits a point where finally, at a point of inflection, the slope changes from positive to negative. We finally go from peak to a contraction of the economy. Highest point peak, contraction, is starting to decrease. There will be a low point, which would be, typically this is the recessionary period, the low point where there's a turnaround. Again, the slope changes, and now we're going to get positive. We hit the bottom of the recession and finally back through an expansion. We can see here that there are these deviation variances away from the long-term growth path. Macroeconomic policy is intended to try to minimize the size of these deviations away. Can't eliminate them altogether, and we certainly want to maintain a long-term growth that's positive, but we try to minimize these deviations or variations away from this long-term growth path to keep us at what we call full employment, unemployment, or full employment capacity utilization in the economy. Just a few other terms that we might want to talk about in macroeconomics. I want to make sure I cover them. We talk about different ways of measuring price level changes. When we get into the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which comes in the very next lecture, we're going to be talking about output levels with real GDP that are contrasted or graphed against price levels in the economy. Fluctuations in the price level of all goods and services are measured in one of a number of different ways. The principal ways that we discuss in this course are CPI, so for price level changes or inflation, we're going to measure CPI, Consumer Price Index, PPI, Producer Price Index, or the GDP deflator. Consumer Price Index measures things that consumers purchase, so it's got the most immediate reflection on the largest component in the expenditures model of aggregate demand. We know that consumption represents approximately 70% of aggregate demand, so fluctuations in the consumer's prices are going to be reflected very largely in what's going on in the entire economy, or GDP. Producer Price Index is a measurement of the fluctuations of prices that producers pay, but remember that producers are manufacturing, firms manufacture things some time ahead of the moment at which they'll be available in stores for consumers to purchase them. So any fluctuations in a producer price index will precede or predict fluctuations in consumer price index. So this is an early indicator. GDP deflator is a broader definition of it's a price adjustment mechanism for everything in GDP. Hence, it's a little broader, more all-encompassing. So these all measure inflation or changes in the price level, but they're doing it based on different collections or groups of commodities that are being sold in the economy, or manufactured and sold. And they give us a little bit different information. This is an early predictor. This is a broad predictor of what's going on, and this is following what consumers do. Some last other terms that we want to discuss are things that pertain to inflation, and we have, for inflation, we have the terms of inflation. We have deflation, disinflation. Those are the basic terms we want to know. Then we have hyperinflation. All of these need to be memorized. And last, stagflation. Inflation is a term that often has been used to refer to the change in the money supply or a change in the price level due to the money supply. For our purposes, we're going to talk about inflation as just a change in the general price level that can't be explained through the real value of money, the time value of money. Inflation, deflation, which is a challenged economy, it's a bit of a peril. If we experience it, it would be a fall in the price of the products being manufactured and sold in the economy. This is not a good thing. It means that the cost of manufacturing something will always be greater than the sales price. And it's a disincentive for firms to be manufacturing and expanding output. This is a bad thing. Disinflation means just a decrease in the rate of inflation, and that could be a good thing if inflation is a high number. We know from history that we had a period of time during which cost a lot. The opportunity cost was a lot of unemployment, but Paul Volcker, who's then the chair of the Federal Reserve Bank, had instituted something called the Volcker disinflation to squeeze high levels of inflation out of the economy. That's how we use the term disinflation. Then we have two special terms, hyperinflation. Sometimes we think about this, well, maybe both in regard to the presidency of Jimmy Carter, when the economy suffered some supply shocks from oil prices. There was OPEC and oil prices going up very high, pushing the price level very high for all commodities. Ultimately, hyperinflation, very high levels of inflation, that's all it means. And stagflation was having the average supply curve, which we'll talk about later, shift leftwards, where there's high levels of inflation and a drop off in real GDP. So when we have low GDP, dropping GDP, and high levels of inflation, it's stagflation. Hyperinflation is just high levels of inflation. Those are the basic terms that you all need to know. You should go through the textbook at the end of every chapter, look at the terms, look at the glossaries, look at the definitions, prepare some flashcards or study sheets, memorize all the terms. The next lecture starts with the aggregate demand, average supply model.